Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. President Trump has already imposed 25% reciprocal tariffs on India, and in 4 days' time it seems likely that 25% more will be imposed for buying Russian oil. So with a total of 50%, India will become one of the most highly tariffed countries in the world, and that raises two critical questions. Why is America doing this, and how should India respond? Those are the key issues I shall discuss today with the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, Donald Trump is threatening 50% tariffs on India, and conceivably he could impose a further penalty related to BRICS. He's suspended trade talks till the tariff dispute is resolved, and he says he doesn't care if India's dead economy sinks. How do you believe India should respond to this?
That's a very good question. But let's just step back a little, because you really asked, why is he doing it? And I think we need to get the background here quite clear. President Trump is actually dismantling what was for a long time an accepted global understanding and a set of treaty obligations under the WTO. And under those treaty obligations, no country is supposed to raise tariffs above the pound level. He's completely junked that. And secondly, and this is very important, most countries are supposed to follow an MFN rule. In other words, whatever tariff you have within your pound limit, it should be the same tariff across all countries. You can't discriminate unless you have a free trade arrangement. Now, clearly, President Trump has junked that, and he intends to use tariffs essentially as a weapon to pressurize people, not necessarily on trade-related issues. I mean, it began with trade-related issues because he said that I'm going to do this for countries with whom I have a large bilateral trade deficit. That's actually bad economics, because bilateral deficits with individual countries don't justify discriminatory tariff treatment, but that was his original idea. It's gone beyond that now. It's, I will use the tariffs whenever I want to punish anybody for whatever I think they're doing which they shouldn't be doing. So quite honestly, if you ask the question, why is he doing it? He's doing it because he's junked the agreed international agreements to which the US is a signatory, which is bad. It creates a huge amount of disruption. It reduces trust in the US, it creates uncertainty. And he's also doing it to pursue non-trade, even non-economic issues like geopolitical compulsions, etc. This makes it extremely difficult to be able to rationalize. In fact, it's impossible to rationalize what he's doing. Now let's come to the second question. What should we do?
Let's pause there. I'll come to the second question in a moment's time. Let's explore the first one. The Trump administration has contradicted itself trying to justify the 25% tariff because India imports Russian oil. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and Peter Navarro, the White House Counselor for Trade, have accused India of funding Putin's war machine. They claim India is earning $50 billion a year exporting to America and then uses that money to buy Russian oil and put money in Putin's pocket. On the other hand, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has said it's okay for China to import Russian oil because this prevents inflation in global energy prices. And as you know, China imports considerably more oil from Russia than India does. So clearly, there's one logic for India and a very different logic for China. What do you make of that?
And you can't make anything of it because I think Marco Rubio is certainly right in the sense that there are no sanctions by the United States on the purchase of oil. The only question they introduced was a price cap on Russia. Everything that we are doing is actually consistent with observing the price cap. So it amounts to saying we're going to allow China to do what it's doing. We also allow the Europeans to buy a hell of a lot of Russian energy. We want to pressurize you for whatever reason, and we're going to use tariffs as a threat. They are not consistent behavior across countries, and that's very clear.
Now, writing in the Financial Times on the 18th, Peter Navarro bluntly said that the intention was to hit India where it hurts. Is this therefore a deliberate vindictive policy targeted at India?
Well, if you take Peter Navarro's statement literally, and he is an important member of the administration, it has to be viewed as a selective effort to target India wherever you believe it will hurt. And there's nothing stopping them from raising the tariff even more. Because once you abandon the notion of any discipline, you can do whatever you like. At the moment, for example, they have made certain exemptions. So the tariffs hit a large proportion, just about half of our exports to the US. If the idea is to use tariffs to punish whoever you don't like, that's an open-ended kind of weapon. It has costs, very big costs, which I hope the sensible people in the US are thinking about. But at the moment, that doesn't seem to be affecting the administration.
In fact, before the Putin-Trump summit in Alaska, Scott Bessent had even clearly suggested that tariffs on India, the penalty in particular for buying Russian oil, could go up even further. And that was contingent on whether Trump could get a deal with Putin. He hasn't got that deal as yet. And it now looks as if Putin might not even be willing to meet Zelensky because Sergei Lavrov is suggesting that meeting's not necessarily in the immediate offing. So there is, I presume, a danger that 25% penalty for buying Russian oil could creep upwards to 30, 35, and 40. We just don't know where it will go.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think, look, the moment you decide that you are not bound by any agreement that you may have entered into, and you agree that tariffs are an instrument that you can use in order to pressurize anyone, it's very difficult to judge what they will do. By the way, I think this has huge costs to the US. It massively reduces the credibility of the US as a trading partner for every country, because a threat that's being used against India could be used by the US against any other country. I mean, they're using it for Brazil. Nothing to do with geopolitics. They're using it for Brazil because under Brazilian law, the Brazilians are proceeding against Bolsonaro, who Trump says is a friend of his. So, I mean, quite frankly, it's a bizarre world.
But it also means that India has clearly fallen out of Trump's favor. He wouldn't be doing this if India was still a country that he wished to have good relations with. He's cut off that connection, hasn't he?
That would certainly appear to be the case, yes.
Let's then come, against that background, to the second question. There seem to be, I presume, two broad choices for India. First, India can grit its teeth and wait for better times, and to an extent, that is what it seems the Modi government is doing. Or it could impose its own tariffs on America and thus resist and fight back. Which of the two would you advise?
That's a good, even better question. I would say we have to recognize one thing. The US is not just any country. It's the largest economy in the world. It's not necessarily anymore the largest trading economy. China has overtaken them. But it's the largest economy in the world, and it's our largest market. So I don't think we can view the US with the same lack of concern which the US seems to be viewing us. because in terms of their economy, our economy is relatively small in size. So the question is, how do we react? Well, I think there's merit in assuming that this whimsical, personality-driven, everyday changing, turning on a dime kind of policy, yes one day, no the other, that this is maybe a temporary phenomenon, and let us try to avoid a confrontation with the US if talking to the US behind closed doors can help them understand. Let me say that what they're doing is doing them in terms of impact on American soft power, impact on American trust, huge damage. And I think a few people in the United States, not too many, but a few people are beginning to say that. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, for example, recently reported as saying this is not the right approach. You need to hear more such voices from the US, because it's only in response to US opinion, maybe business opinion, that the Americans might change their view. So from that point of view, if the government is adopting a non-confrontational policy of discussing with the US behind closed doors to see if we can reach an agreement, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, let me put it this way. If the US is acting like a bully, sort of in effect bullying everybody else, and if the whole world had reacted to that by saying, look, if you're going to impose these tariffs, we will impose reciprocal tariffs, we should have joined that also. But it's very interesting that the Europeans, their initial reaction was exactly that if you're going to impose these tariffs, we'll impose tariffs too. But over time, they've weakened that very considerably and succumbed. Lots of people have commented on that. The only country that's been able to make the US rethink and step back is actually China. Now, paradoxically, if you look at the US's own definition of who is threatening the US international position, it's China. And then they've done that quite explicitly by saying we intend to threaten, we intend to sort of basically replace you as a leader of technology, as a leader in geopolitics, rallying other countries around, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the Chinese are able to do that because they control aspects of trade which would immediately hit the United States. Supply of materials which are crucial to the entire electronics and high-tech industry. So basically, the Chinese have said, look, if you impose a reciprocal tariff, we'll do the same thing. And the US has backed down. So this is a very clear play that the US can be, as it were, persuaded to not do something if you have economic power. And if you don't have economic power, they'll do whatever they like. Now, in our case, we have to recognize that since our economy is much smaller than the US, I don't think we provide the US with anything which is critical for the US. It helps their consumers, but it's not critical for the US. And if the US decides that we don't care about that, well, consumers will find the prices of various things going up, but it won't immediately threaten the visible parts of the US economy, which is high tech, which is supposed to be driving their technology and their economy. So, what do? I think in this case, we recognize that we should not be led into a position because of President Trump's attitudes, which would basically worsen the gulf between India and the United States. There was a lot of coming together of the two countries in multiple dimensions, people to people, business to business, soft power, and all of that kind of stuff, through successive American administrations and even successive Indian administrations. The present Indian government, until very recently, had a pretty good relationship with President Trump. That's been completely undone, but it's very clear that it's been undone because of the totally personalized nature of US diplomacy at the present state. I think we have to accept that as something we can't alter. In the present situation, merely threatening reciprocal tariffs, as opposed to having a discussion and see whether the US will not impose these tariffs, the second, which is what the government is doing, is the better option. Now, if they do impose these tariffs, we'll know in 2 or 3 days. If they do impose these tariffs, then you have to consider where there's certain important elements of trade with the US you want to interfere in. I mean, for example, clearly defense supplies are extremely important. We have lots of ongoing activity. I am not an expert on that, but I'm sure those who work on this would ask themselves, can we treat the US as a reliable supplier? I don't know what the answer would be, but what President Trump is doing certainly will not lead them to think that the US is a reliable supplier. And there are other civilian, I mean, purchase of aircraft, that kind of stuff. You know, you do have some power, some bargaining power. But relative to the size of the US economy, is not very large.
You're making a very good point in that comprehensive answer. The reason why India must not immediately rush to retaliate with tariffs of its own is because we simply don't have the leverage that China does. There's nothing that we export to America that America can't do without. China, on the other hand, has rare earth minerals, metals, and magnets which America desperately needs. They have, therefore, leverage. We simply don't. And to retaliate or to attempt to retaliate in the absence of leverage would actually make the situation much worse for us.
Absolutely right. You know, we are roughly where China was in 2004, say 20 years ago. If our ambitions about getting to Viksit Bharat materialize, and then we have to do a lot to achieve that, we will get to where China is today in 20 years. Now, go back to 2004. The Chinese were not being aggressive at all. The Chinese were actually being very open and sort of not at all trying to throw their weight around. They're quietly building up their own strength, and they successfully built it up, both in the economy and technology, and they're now able to benefit from the leverage that they gain. So we ought to be focusing on our own economy, in a way treating the cost that President Trump has imposed on us as a reason for looking internally to see how do we improve the competitiveness of our own export. And remember, the United States is only about 10 or 11% of world trade. 89% of world trade is outside the United States. But a lot of people say we can export there, but we are competing there and we're not doing well. And the short answer is, if you really want to do well in that area, there's a very large number of things we need to do at home to improve our competitiveness.
I'll come to that in a moment's time because I think it's a critical aspect of our discussion today. But let me begin this second part of the interview by putting this to you. If gritting our teeth, grinning and bearing it is the most sensible option for us, if not the only option, what do you believe will be the impact on India's economy of America's 50% tariffs? First, tell me, in terms of the exports, how badly will they suffer and which ones in particular?
Well, I think exports definitely will suffer. I mean, let's face it, they're our largest export market. They haven't actually sanctioned all of our exports. But I mean, they could do that tomorrow. Pharmaceuticals are excluded, electronics are excluded, certain other things are not affected. But garments, leather, gems and jewelry, these kinds of things, including shrimp exports and so on, would be very much affected. And I mean, in terms of the total economy, if our exports to the US are roughly about a little less than 2% of our GDP, probably and half of them are affected, that 1% of GDP. They will be reduced because of the high tariff, not just because of the high tariff. They will also be reduced because others are having a low tariff. So we have a competitive disadvantage. I mean, if the US were to impose a 50% tariff on all countries exporting shrimp, we would collectively be hurt, but not as much as if India has a 50% tariff and Vietnam has 19. So I think we will be hurt. And, if you convert that into GDP, it's not going to be that big a loss. It's not very different from, let's say, a bad agricultural year. But in a concentrated area, it'll be very bad. I mean, for example, diamond cutters and jewelry, etc., in Surat will be very badly hurt. Textiles in Tirupur, in Ludhiana, a couple of other places, in Gujarat also, they would be very badly hurt. The leather exports out of Chennai would be very badly hurt. And so, therefore, in a concentrated way, the impact will be worse. And these are labor intensive products. So, actually, the impact will be extremely negative on employment.
Dr. Rangaraj, the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, writing in The Hindu, has estimated that as a result of these tariffs, India's growth could be affected by something like 0.6%. Do you
I think that's
right?
actually that's not unreasonable. I mean, let's put it this way. The biggest question is we don't really know what the underlying growth will be in the current year. The Reserve Bank had projected 6.5%, but that was before the tariffs. Now, that growth is not just going to be affected by American trade, it's going to be affected by what the American tariffs do to the global economy. So, global exports and global trade will shrink. Those who compete with us will be competing much more fiercely in the non-US market, simply because they've been pushed a little bit out of the American market. More than that, it has created huge uncertainty on foreign investment. So I think investment flows will be very uncertain. And uncertainty about foreign investment flows will certainly spill over into private investment flows. So if you take all these things into account, it would not be unreasonable to say that for the next 2 years, let's say, you can knock off, say, 0.5% of GDP from what it would otherwise be. But the question is, what would it otherwise be? That's also uncertain. On the whole, it's negative.
The export sectors that you mentioned are all very labor intensive. So I take it that there will be a massive hit on jobs on some people who are amongst the most vulnerable in the country.
Yes, definitely. No question about it.
And that is another very worrying problem for India, both economically, but also it has political ramifications.
Yeah, no, clearly we need to do something to help the exporters in these areas. Now, what exactly it is, the government will have to work out. I mean, I'm sure that they will give them credit. But, giving credit is a good thing if you believe this is temporary. In other words, if the backroom diplomacy that we are working on, we think will resolve the issue in a year, and I don't know, but obviously the government has a better idea of its own judgment, then credit helps tide people over. But if we're not going to remove these, and these guys have become vulnerable, I don't think credit is a solution at all. Because by taking credit, they'll only be taking on debt that they can't repay. And we shouldn't make an easy assumption that, oh, well, we have the rest of the world to export to. That's true. And we should do more in the rest of the world. But to do that, we require a very concentrated burst of reforms, well-defined reforms implemented in the next year or two, which would improve productivity in these areas. Otherwise, the world may be there, but all the world's exporters are also there competing for the same market.
Spell out the reforms that you think are necessary, or at least the reforms that now can be introduced, because this is an opportunity to do so.
Well, of course, that's a very big, to respond to that question, let me take a step back. I think it's a mistake, just on the trade front, to view this as a trade challenge from the United States based on a dismantling of the global order, which had assumed that we will have access to each other's markets. I think the correct definition is the rest of the world is not following the United States. They are not necessarily raising protective barriers. I know they're doing it vis-a-vis China in the case of Europe, but they're not doing it across the board the way President Trump is doing. And deep down, they don't actually believe this is the right way to go. So I think our trade strategy should be deal with the US as best we can, recognizing that it's a powerful but an important player and an important market. So as it were, giving them a little room to allow their personal peculiarities more tolerance, just to make sure that, we bring them back to a sensible position. But we should aggressively integrate with the rest of the world, reassuring them that what President Trump and his colleagues are saying about India, that India is a tariff king, India doesn't want trade, etc., this is comprehensively wrong. Now, in that sense, the UK FTA that we've signed is an excellent development. I believe we are negotiating with the EU. We should sign that as quickly as possible. Now, this, by the way, will raise some problems for our negotiators. The issue is not going to be just the tariffs. I mean, I know there'll be issues on French wine. These things can be sorted out without too much difficulty. The issue will be we will have to align standards in non-trade areas. Now, quite frankly, that is what has been happening in the last 20 years. And unfortunately, our negotiators traditionally have operated on the assumption that trade negotiations are about trade, and other things like IPR, investment protection, labor standards, environmental protection, these are non-trade areas and should not form part of the FTA. I think we should, at the highest level, junk this idea. The reason is that if you want to integrate with the world, nobody is willing to integrate with you if you don't want to integrate in some of these other things. Now, of course, we can negotiate. I mean, we don't have to surrender everything. But, a large country like India, and one, let's say, we are hoping that we will get to Viksit Bharat. To these areas, the assured access to an Indian market justifies them giving us more time to comply. This is the time to sign those agreements. And FTA with the EU is one thing. We need to look eastward. I mean, we opted out of RCEP, which I think was regrettable. But apparently, Indian industry just didn't want to compete with China, and there was some concern on dairy. Well, we should sign the CPTPP. That is a very large trade agreement helmed by Japan. It includes Korea, it includes Japan, some of the ASEAN countries, Australia, and it's what they call a deep, modern type of trade agreement. It does not include China. Now, the UK has joined the CPTPP. The EU has applied to join the CPTPP. India should apply to join the CPTPP. It won't happen instantly. There will be negotiation. But it's very important for us to apply before China does and to get in before China does. Because once China is a member, it will have practically a veto on allowing other people to come in. So we will strengthen our bargaining position in the future by joining the CPTPP. That will require the government at the highest levels telling our trade negotiators and also creating a broader economic consensus in the country that this is in our interest. Because I think the big danger today, I find, a lot of people say, well, the US has chucked up the global trade order, they're raising protective barriers, now we should also do the same thing. And that's the way to succeed. That is comprehensively wrong. That is a guaranteed way for us to fail. And there's therefore a contradiction. I mean, we will be arguing that while the US is raising tariffs, we should be lowering tariffs. Our objective should be to characterize the United States as a tariff king. And our tariffs should be much lower than what President Trump has imposed.
I hear what you're saying, and it makes to many people a lot of sense. Extend and expand the number of free trade agreements you have, starting with the EU. Join multilateral groupings like RCEP and CPTPP. But what about something narrower and more focused on America? Can we afford to lower tariffs on American agricultural produce like corn and soya bean, or American dairy produce? Those, I believe, were the sticking points that led to the reciprocal tariffs, not to the Russian penalty, but the reciprocal tariffs. Can we afford to lower tariffs in these areas, at least to overcome the first 25%?
Well, in all countries, agriculture is always a very sensitive matter, and governments take positions on it. As far as the corn and soybean issue is concerned, we have taken an internal position. We're not allowing Indian farmers to have access to GM seeds. It would be very odd to refuse to allow Indian farmers to have access to these seeds and to allow American products based on these seeds to come in. So quite frankly, if we need to change, we have to explain to the Americans that we need to consider what is our position on GM. And frankly, if our position on GM really is that we don't want any GM crops, and by the way, I am not convinced that that is the right position. Because after all the Indians who sit here and happily say, no, no, we should never allow GM crops, I don't see them objecting to eating American food when they go there on the grounds it is full of GM products. On dairy, there's a sort of a slightly more difficult problem, a religious prohibition, because the concern is that the dairy is, if the cows have been fed with feed, which includes the meat of other cows or extract of the meat and bones of other cows, then it violates religious prohibitions. I think the Americans should realize that these prohibitions are there. They will, of course, say that, look, why do you prevent the import? Just force us to put a large sort of advertisement on the product saying this product contains X, Y, and Z, and let the system respond. It's a difficult area. By the way, I do not believe that this is the sticking point, because there are many areas in agriculture which we have already given some access, and we could actually do more. That's not a problem.
So you're suggesting we could be more reasonable?
I think that on agriculture, to be honest, we need to reformulate our internal position on these bigger issues. You cannot possibly allow the import of GM food if your domestic position is that we will not allow our farmers to get access to GM seeds in the food area. So that policy has to be rethought. You know, there is a case for rethinking. I mean, there are very strong views on this. I mean, for example, a lot of our NGOs and environmentalists have very strong views. But, you know, on the other hand, you have to weigh this against what is going to be the impact of climate change. I mean, if climate change is going to reduce agricultural productivity by 15%, and the only kind of scientific way of offsetting that is by developing seeds that will resist this, and those seeds are genetically modified, you need to take a view. Are we denying ourselves this or not? And that needs a public debate with more scientific participation. You know, at the moment, I mean, originally, the objection to GM seeds was that it comes from Western pharma companies. But we have stopped even Delhi University's GM modified mustard or something like that. It's not been released. So the objection is not just to American products. The objection is to the products themselves. And certainly, I mean, I think we should look at, conduct a proper internal debate and get a sense of scientific assessment. I do not know, for example, what our scientists really recommend in this area. I know what our NGOs recommend. I know what politically motivated groups would recommend. But what does the Indian scientific community say about the nature of evidence in this area? I don't know.
There's one more issue that I want to touch on with you. Many people say the way into Trump's heart, the way into his favor is flattery. Is that what we should be doing? Pakistan has used it very effectively and very successfully. Should we be emulating Pakistan, or is it now too late for that?
I don't know enough about what Pakistan has done. I believe they have nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. They have also invested a lot of money in companies that are related to either President Trump or his family. I don't see that we can compete in that area, quite honestly. But, you know, when you talk about flattery, I mean, all of diplomacy is ultimately pleasing other people. The entire image of the whole of Europe turning up in the White House, sitting like good, obedient school children in front of President Trump, could be described as a form of flattery, and indeed, many people have described it. Nothing wrong with that. Look, diplomacy is about being effective, and you are effective when you respond to the kind of, if you like, personal predilections of people, but while pursuing your national interests solidly. So within that constraint, if there are ways of pleasing President Trump, I mean, I would leave it to our diplomats. That's what they're for.
Let me end Montek Singh Ahluwalia by quoting what Peter Navarro wrote in that Financial Times article that I referred to earlier. He said, if India wants to be treated as a strategic partner of the United States, it needs to start acting like one. Are we, by insisting on multipolarity, we no longer talk of non-alignment, but by insisting on multipolarity, are we politically sending the wrong message to someone who economically we need to be close to?
Well, that's a genuine challenge. I mean, our assessment that the world has become multipolar, and therefore we are not going to become allies of any one pole. We actually want to have relations with everyone. I think that's basically correct. I mean, the way to make this less of a problem is to get the different multipolar groups, at least on trade, on the same platform. Now, what Mr. Navarro has said about being a strategic partner, my view would be whatever your strategic perceptions, we should all agree that trade is not a weapon to be used to pursue strategic options. There are other weapons you can use: military alliances, cooperation, non-cooperation, etc., etc. I mean, quite frankly, if the world were to get involved, if the world were to sanctify an approach where large countries can use trade sanctions and economic sanctions to pursue geopolitical ends, we will actually disrupt a potentially sort of cooperative global system from emerging. One of the biggest consequences of this is the lack of trust in the United States. I mean, the US will have interest in many, many subnational or mini-polar contests. And we should certainly be free in those contexts to judge who we want to support based on our national interest. But we should also be reassured that if in that area we end up supporting someone which is different from the United States, they're not going to pull the rug from under our feet by disrupting the entire trade system. Anyway, the next thing about disrupting the trade system would be the financial system. I mean, if you can have trade tariffs, can you kick people out of the SWIFT, the method of international payments? Can you freeze their reserves if they're held in dollars? I mean, if you translate what Mr. Navarro is saying, that you got to prove you're a strategic partner to get strategic area benefits, that's okay. But if you translate this into saying that if you're not behaving the way I think a strategic partner should behave, I can undo the entire web of economic relationships upon which you depend in the global economy. That's a disastrous consequence. And I don't know if he's thought about it, quite frankly. This is something.
Certainly what he's hinting at.
Oh, he's certainly hinting at that. But what I said is, I don't think he's thought about it. And let me say, I do believe in the United States, it's very sad that in the United States, not enough people are talking about whether this policy of their government makes sense. In the 30s, when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs came up, 1,000 economists, US economists, wrote to the president saying, please don't sign this legislation, it'll be very bad. What has been done is much bigger than Smoot-Hawley, and we have not seen a comparable reaction from American economists. And that may be because US institutions, all the liberal universities, etc., are separately under threat. So they're a little concerned. But I can't help feeling that when these things get debated, and they will be debated over the next year or two, President Trump and Mr. Navarro will realize that he has very little support amongst his own intellectual, professional community. And surely that must affect US policy and US thinking at some time. That's the logic of saying, don't act hastily, but give them a little bit of room to work these things out.
And that's also one of the hopes we have to hold on to. Montek Ahluwalia, thank you very much for the time you've given me. I'm deeply grateful for your analysis of the situation, if not the challenge we face. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.